Wow. Following the Iron Cowboy, oh my. Obviously, we are all inspired by what he has shared with us. And for me, it's about seizing the moment and seizing the opportunity that we have as professionals. And one of the executives here at ObservePoint, who has heard some of my stories yesterday, said, hey, you know, my life isn't anything like yours. And I said, it's just a matter of perspective. And today, I want you to take in all of these experiences, feel inspired by where we're at, feel the adventure that we're going to have this afternoon. And I want to invite you into an adventure that I took part in. And so, as Kyle said, I ended my career with the U.S. government as the Chief Information Security Officer for the U.S. Postal Service. I had served 25 years as a federal law enforcement officer. In 1996, I got my gun and my badge, and I reported to San Jose, California. And at that time, there were a few companies that were developing these technologies. One of them is a really important customer and partner of ObservePoint, Adobe. They actually were down the street from the U.S. Attorney's Office that in February of 2000 asked me to work an investigation. At the time, this was early 2000s. February 2000, the U.S. Attorney's Office said, hey, we've got this criminal that's putting counterfeit software on CD-ROMs, and I know we don't do this anymore, but this guy's mailing those CD-ROMs into the United States, and Adobe is concerned about this guy and all his counterfeiting operations. And he was, as a federal law enforcement officer, so some of you may not be aware, the Postal Service has a federal law enforcement organization, 1,400 federal law enforcement officers. We investigate mail fraud, mail theft, and bombs in the mail, and anthrax. And my job was to investigate fraud that related to mailings. And we were receiving thousands of complaints from this new startup, around this new startup that was in Silicon Valley, not far from where Adobe's headquarters was. That little startup was called eBay. People weren't getting the goods that they were receiving, that they had sold online, or they weren't getting paid for the goods that they had sold online. They weren't getting the goods that they had paid for. And so people were putting fraud complaints into our fraud complaints center. And I, with all of these complaints, drove over to Hamilton Avenue in San Jose, where eBay was headquartered, and said, hey, we need to do something about this. And they had a trust and safety unit. And they welcomed me with open arms into this unit. I kind of became a law enforcement officer extension of their trust and safety organization. It was interesting. We had all of these, so the types of frauds that were being conducted. I mentioned what was going on with Adobe. I had to pick the litter of all the fraud cases that were going on against that organization, and I chose to focus in on this case that the U.S. Attorney's Office gave me. And the subject was in Ukraine, and he was sending his CDs into the United States from Ukraine, and we needed to associate how all of these mailings were, why all these mailings were coming in, who was responsible for them. And so I went to the eBay headquarters, and I said, here's some of the auctions that are being run. This is the mailings that are coming in. Can you help me start to associate all of these mailings to these fraudulent auctions so that I can investigate who is responsible for these? And you know what the secret to me putting all this case together was? Cookies. They were able to tell me that the subject that was running all these fraudulent auctions, they were able to tie them all together with cookies. And they said, hey, we've got these 5 accounts that are associated to running all of these auctions, and as a result, we've got all of these fraud transaction reports coming in. And this guy that was responsible for the fraud, he went by the screen identity of Blade. And so I was investigating this guy in Ternopil, Ukraine. Now, I'm a law enforcement officer in San Jose, California. This is on the other side of the planet. This is early 2000. And at the time, Ukraine was eastern facing. There was no way I was going to be able to get cooperation from a Ukrainian law enforcement officer to get this guy arrested. And he had recruited people across the United States, and he went on to message boards with Ukrainian exchange students, Russian exchange students, and he would recruit these students to receive money for him. And when they were in the United States, he'd tell them, hey, go to a mailboxes, etc., set up a mailboxes account so that when I do this auction, you can get money and send the money to me. And you know, they were kind of duped into the scheme, half unwitting. And I chased all these payments around the country. All the email communications were traced back to an internet service provider in Fremont, California. It happened, this internet service provider happened to be on my drive into the office every morning. And I stopped by and I said, hey, this guy's hacked into your systems and he sends all his fraud communications through this. And they basically gave me a wiretap. 40,000 emails later and about 3 years worth of investigation. Thanks to eBay being able to put all the transactions together from a cookies perspective, millions of dollars worth of fraud. I intercepted an email communication and said, hey, my wife and I want to go to Bangkok, Thailand for vacation. And so Blade, then I knew him to be, his true name was Maxime Kowalchuk, planned a vacation to go, him and his wife, to Koh Samui and to Bangkok. My big opportunity. So I approached the U.S. Attorney's Office that had asked me to start this case 3 years earlier, and I said, hey, we've got an opportunity to arrest this guy. We got the arrest warrant, the request for provisional arrest. We worked through the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok, and I don't have a clicker. Oh, there it is, got it. We arrested Maxime. I've been investigating him for 3 years. This was May of 2003, and the Royal Thai Police, I was there at his arrest and got to interview him. So we go back to the police station. They put him, incarcerate him for the evening, and the next morning, I come with some representatives from the U.S. Embassy, and the U.S. embassies around the world get foreign service nationals. These are typically former law enforcement officers that help in the investigative process. And I'm interviewing him, and he's not cooperating with me. And they, little female foreign service national, she is 4'11", 95 pounds soaking wet. She goes up to Maxime and she says, you remember last night, you helped these men. You remember last night, I make it 1,000 times worse. Now, he had just spent one night in Bangkok jail. right? That'll make any hard man humble. And he totally cooperated with me. And he explained his role in a significant organized crime ring that was stealing credit card information, doing all types of different fraud schemes. He was the first subject to ever steal the username and password of a power seller account for eBay and use that power seller account as that victim account in order to be able to get massive amounts of run auctions. So really early days. This case sent me on a journey for the next 7 years to track the origins of Eastern European organized cybercrime. And it really was an exciting time. And a couple of years later, the Russians, I had an opportunity to work with the Russian FSB. And very unusual collaboration for a U.S. law enforcement officer to work with the Russians. They used to ask me, Mr. Greg Crabb, are you professional? And my recommendation to all of you is never answer that question. Always innovate. Always show them whether you are, they wanted to know whether I was a spy with that question. And always show them that you are a professional. And that's one of the great things of the American way, is we have the ability to innovate. And I'm going to talk to you about innovation. I recently joined a venture capital firm in Silicon Valley called Holistic Ventures. They fund cybersecurity startups. They've got about 16 cybersecurity companies in their portfolio. They're just raised a couple $100 million to start probably another 12 to 16 companies. And I love helping companies innovate. And I've got a very basic framework for innovation. But before that, I want to ask you, in your roles, do you, and if you could go on to slide over here, I don't know if you guys used this yesterday. I want to know, on a scale of 1 to 5, how involved are you in supporting security, fraud detection, or risk analytics for your organization's websites? Because you sit at a very interesting juncture with all of the analytics that you have in order to be able to help your fraud teams, your compliance teams. Fascinating. Thank you. So, fast forward, I think Iron Cowboy, he shared so many different things, but adaptability was one of the things that he focused on. And over the 25 years of my law enforcement career and 3 years since I've rebranded after drawing my pension, adaptability is always what drove me. And for my organization in the U.S. Postal Service, I ultimately became the Chief Information Security Officer for the Post Office in 2014, and I had that role until 2021. One of my most important functions was to protect the external-facing website of the Postal Service, and my marketing analytics personnel were some of my best sources of intelligence to be able to help me from a fraud analytics perspective. Because you know the behaviors of your users. And those behaviors can help your organization, protect your organization from fraud, security, and compliance. And so I'm going to share and change some of, hopefully, your perspective on what you can provide with using some of the tools that come from ObservePoint, and thinking about them in a little different way. So what are the types of things that your websites are subject to from a security perspective? You have weak security configurations. And I ran into this first, this was 2018, November of 2018. A couple of researchers approached the Postal Service and said, hey, we've identified a vulnerability on your website. And how many of you have a service called Informed Delivery from the U.S. Postal Service where you see the images of mail pieces that are coming to your house? I was responsible for all of the identity and access management activities to enroll you into that service. I built that from scratch. By the time I left the organization, we had enrolled 40 million Americans. Since I've left, they've enrolled another 20 million into that program. And the researchers said, hey, you've got an exposed API that is leaking some of the consumer information. And we can enumerate your database to be able to bring back the user's address, phone number, and email address. And I was like, oh shoot, that's a problem. And so fortunately we were able to fix it before it was exposed, but understanding the complexities of your externally facing website are extremely important. So the types of things from a third-party dependency perspective that you have with the partners that host your website can be leaking information that's extremely sensitive for your company. And so when we think about what we need to do, and one fundamental concept of innovation is, collaborating with those parties that deliver the value for your organization. We need to understand what those are and how you collaborate with your pen testers and your researchers and understand all of the behaviors that are possible through the website. So I want to ask you now, and based on your initial question, responses, I think I've got a good idea of where you'll fall on this, but I was an interim CISO for a financial services organization, and they saw a huge surge in fraudulent account openings. And they had a regulatory request from their regulators as to why they saw a significant spike in the fraudulent accounts opening on their website. And I want to ask you, if you had this request come in from your regulator, would you be involved in addressing that situation? Even if it would have been a small part of kind of what came in from the regulatory. So for this organization, I need you to help me investigate this. So it's the online account opening application for a financial services organization. And the financial services organization in account opening has to collect a lot of information. Name, address, telephone number, email address. And there's a lot of APIs that are exposed to be able to provide these. You've got to collect your social security number to do KYC. You've got to collect a lot of information. And one of the things that we found was that there was no client-server validation of the account opening application. So what the criminals were doing were leveraging APIs that allowed them to inject all of this information into the back-end databases. What didn't we have? What would be one thing if they were using APIs to inject into the back end all of this fraudulent information into account openings, what would be something that they wouldn't have from a log management perspective for all of the transactions? They wouldn't have the web traffic. They wouldn't have cookies, right? Because you'd have no visibility. They never visited actually the web page to do all of the fraudulent activity. So we worked with the pen testers. We showed the organization how this bypass of the user interface was being made for SMS verification, telephone number verification, KYC validation, so that the criminals could open up the fraudulent accounts. And so, from an analytics perspective, how important is the type of information that you have about cookies, tag management, user behavior, in understanding the conduct of consumers that are enrolling in your websites? Are you important to that process? Would you have been important in helping us investigate how those fraudulent accounts were being opened at that financial institution? I hope this has you thinking a little bit differently about the power of the information that you have at your fingertips through the ObservePoint solution, as well as all of the logging and monitoring that you have on the back end of all of these activities that go on. So, for 30 years I worked for the United States government. For several years I was at the Department of Energy, and I remember one of the first briefings I ever received was about the concern of Chinese nationals operating against the United States, stealing all of the basic and applied research that were being made at the laboratories. The Chinese government has very different motives than the United States in their outcomes. There's a big conflict brewing. I don't know if many of you know about that conflict in the South China Sea. It's around Taiwan, and will have a huge impact potentially on ship production, security for the globe. It's going to be a huge, it will be a significant development when China attacks Taiwan. And the Chinese government is preparing. And so one of the things that I think is very important, we look back to a significant business partner that I had at U.S. Postal Service. It was early 2017. Many of you probably have partnered with this organization, and in April of 2017, I remember it to the day, I was sitting in our training center talking to a bunch of folks, and my manager of threat intelligence pulls me out of the meeting and says, "Hey Greg, we have a significant situation. One of the web components, there's a zero-day attack against one of the web components of our website. It is called Apache Struts, and we have 17 different instantiations across our environment relative to this component. We need to get these updated immediately." Fortunately for me, in the next 24 to 48 hours, we had all of the systems patched. Unfortunately, one of my biggest business partners, the partner that I used to help me enroll tens of millions of Americans, did not patch that vulnerability. That partner of mine was Equifax. And it took them about 6 months to realize that China had hacked into and stolen the information of 147 million Americans, probably your information, and all of the information that I was asking. My work process was all about know your customer. So you used those 3 questions, some of you in your website experience. Well, my whole enrollment process up until that moment was the 3 questions, right? Out of wallet. Well, as a U.S. government agency, I had to go up to Congress and work with them. Well, they weren't so kind about, hey, you've got to change immediately. In 90 days, I went from basing all of my identity and access management on KYC to a different methodology that involved out-of-band communications with SMS messaging. It was a huge response to what China had done against Equifax. About a couple of months ago, early April or May, the FBI, the Australian government, NSA, and the UK government issued an advisory. I've got a link to the advisory on the slide here, about how China is focused on attacking websites, vulnerabilities on websites, in order to be able to do the types of things that Chris Ray is talking about on this slide. And I think we as professionals need to understand that your web properties are very important things for your company to hold and possess, but also could be a very strategic asset for the Chinese government in trying to leverage attacks against the United States. So competition in this context is extremely important, and I believe that you hold significant keys to be able to help your organization protect against these types of threats. I used 6 steps to protect the nation from these types of nation-state adversaries. This time, 4 years ago, I was still the Chief Information Security Officer for the U.S. Postal Service. I had an election to protect. At the time, it was COVID. A lot of people were concerned to go into the ballot box, and most of the election was made through the U.S. mail. And my entire existence for the year leading up to the election was, how do I do this securely? And fortunately, I had developed a great relationship with Greg Crabb at CCPA, and I had my threat intelligence folks on the watchroom floor with CCPA in advance of and through the entire election process. And about 70 million ballots were cast through the U.S. mail. That was nearly 50% of all the ballots cast through the election. These 6 steps help guide me through that process. You have to understand who your threats are. And one of the things that I think is extremely important as marketing professionals, as security compliance officers, that relationship that you can build to be able to support your security teams in being able to protect your front end and understand who those fraud groups are, who those nation-state actors could be that are attempting to get access to the personal information of your consumers and trying to attack your organization. So I encourage you to understand your threats. Define the intelligence needs that you have from an organizational perspective. So, what are we attempting to do? What are the types of attacks? So an intelligence statement need might be, what are the types of attacks that our website could experience? Could we be exposed to that kind of API vulnerability attack that I mentioned earlier? Could we be exposed to attacks where people are trying to set up fraudulent accounts? Do you have pieces of information that might be able to help prioritize the assets and services that are the construct of your website? And I think that's one of the things that ObservePoint really helps you do, is understand what is your website composed of from an engagement perspective with your consumer and how you prioritize those assets. And then your security group and you can work and collect and analyze information. That's what you guys do best, right? You are all about data analytics. And how can we leverage some of those analytics that are helping you to improve performance from a customer engagement perspective, to be also able to protect it from a fraud and theft perspective. So these 6 steps really help you become ready, responsive, and resilient. So my last question here is, do you have the tools necessary to support security analytics for your organization's website? If you think about what you have in your own hands and what your organization has in order to be able to protect itself, if you collectively work together, do you have what you need in order to be able to protect against some of the attacks that I've shared? This is encouraging. I love to see that you've got the security analytics that you need for your websites. I'd love to engage in more conversations about how you put your tools together in order to be able to get the outcomes to do fraud detection and prevention. Also, in order to be able to protect against external threats that your organization might be facing. And if there's ways that we can give you more in order to be able to leverage tools from an analytics perspective to even raise our bar and protect against the threats that our organizations face. My last story, so financial institutions. I had a great partnership as a law enforcement officer with a lot of different financial institutions. And criminals used to like to do fraud in order to be able to set up fraudulent credit cards, set up fraudulent bank accounts, take over those credit cards or bank accounts, and they do it through the U.S. mail. And so I would get the way that the fraud would work was they would call the call center of the financial institution, say, I want to change my address for a particular account and get a new credit card issued and sent through the mail. That informed delivery service, the fraudsters used to set up fraudulent accounts. And they would go through and enroll accounts for a cul-de-sac. And so they would target a geography. They said, hey, this is a cul-de-sac with a lot of financially lucrative folks. We can set up fraudulent accounts in their names. And they go into informed delivery and start to see the mail pieces for all of the consumers in that cul-de-sac. And so I worked with our marketing analytics folks. I worked with our my law enforcement brothers, and we put the analytics together to be able to know that a set of accounts on informed delivery were going to be used for fraud. Cookie analytics was very important to that, because I could say, hey, this criminal has opened up these accounts over this last weekend, and now they're looking at all of the mail pieces going to that cul-de-sac. And I set law enforcement officers to surveil that cul-de-sac when the mail was delivered in order to be able to arrest the criminals. The power of what you have from an analytics perspective with cookies and tag management, as well as the other information that you can have from a frequency distribution and analytics perspective, can be extremely powerful to be able to detect, prevent, and investigate fraud that occurs against you and your organizations. And fortunately, we were able to arrest a number of subjects by me being able to tell my law enforcement colleagues which cul-de-sacs to sit in to be able to watch them steal the mail and catch them red-handed. So with that, if you'd like to get a free copy of my threat intelligence book, just share your email with the jot form there, and if you'd like to connect on LinkedIn, QR code's there as well. I'd love to thank ObservePoint for giving me an opportunity to share with you my passion for their tools and product set, and how we can think differently, how we can use those tools in order to be able to help our organizations do better fraud analytics and be a better consumer, better provider for our consumers. So thank you so much.